We started on this chapter last week. You might recall, got started into this section. And as we started in on this, we talked about this meeting, first of all, between Jonathan and David, that these two men become very close friends, very committed friends. I'll say it that way. Very committed friends. The Bible tells us that there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. And certainly Jonathan was that kind of friend to David. And we talked about here a little bit, here as Jonathan, it says here in verse 4, Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt. And by handing over these possessions to David, this was more than just, here, have some clothes, here, have some gifts. This was very symbolic in its action, because if you recall, Jonathan is the crown prince. He is the heir apparent. And for him to give David these things suggests or signifies to David that he understands that David is the next king of Israel. And this is a remarkably humble thing for this man to do. It shows us quite a bit about the character of Jonathan. It's interesting that we see we'll see ongoing this contrast between the character of Saul and then the character of his son Jonathan. That the things that Saul does are more and more self-centered. They are more and more vicious. They are actually more and more virtually insane from a particular point of view. It's like an insanity that has seized Saul. Jonathan, of character and integrity and of great humility. We talked about in verse 5 that this one verse here in verse 5 suggests actually a fairly lengthy block of time that David is going out to war as one of Saul's commanders, and is rapidly being promoted, rapidly finds himself at the head of military group, and is enjoying tremendous success. I think we did get into this section, the next section a little bit here in verse 6. And it happened as they were coming, when David returned from killing the Philistine, that the women came out of the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang as they played, saying, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. And then Saul became very angry. We talked about this a little bit, that first of all, the reading here of killing the Philistine is probably incorrect. It probably should be plural, the Philistines. This is not an event describing Saul's killing of Goliath, for example, but of rather David's ongoing success against the Philistines. The people, the nation of Israel, sees this success. They see that the relative safety that they're able to enjoy because of David's success and because of Saul's success, and they are grateful for it. The song these women sing, we should understand, was not intended as any kind of an insult or a slight against Saul, but rather it is simply a thankfulness of the growing success of the Israelite army. And in a way, it is meant to be, I suspect, complimentary of Saul, that he and his generals are doing such a fine job, but Saul finds fault in it. We find then that in verse 10 that came out the next day. We talked about this too a little bit. Here it is, the very next day that they come back from apparently a lengthy campaign. It says an evil spirit from God came mightily upon Saul, and he raved in the midst of the house, while David was playing the harp with his hand as usual, and a spear was in Saul's hand. And Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped from his presence twice. Now Saul was afraid of David, for the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. We again should understand this evil spirit from the Lord. This was not the possession, like an evil spirit position like we read about in the New Testament. The folks that were in the New Testament, apparently when they were being possessed by those demons in the New Testament, they had no control over their own actions. The demons had control, and they had no control. This is not the case here. Saul has control. Saul can stop what he's doing. But Saul is allowing that rage. He's being perhaps motivated and egged on and being stirred up by this evil spirit. But Saul is still in control. Saul can still call a halt to it. Saul can still calm himself, but he won't do it. He won't calm himself down. He'd rather be in a rage. He'd rather be suspicious and paranoid. And some have suggested maybe even, a paranoid delusion or something like that. That Saul's other behaviors suggest that he's in control of himself when he wants to be. And at times he simply lets the beast go, if you will, and allows that anger to be focused on David. Again, because we see why. Saul was afraid of David. Why? Because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. Saul knows what's going on. Saul knew that he had received the Spirit of God. We read that back in 1 Samuel in the 8th, 9th, 10th chapters, where Saul had received that Spirit of the Lord, and he had enjoyed great success in military matters and in command and in other aspects of being in charge of Israel. We saw that Saul had that great ability that had come from God, and he knew it came from God. He wasn't born. He wasn't born this way. He didn't demonstrate this leadership potential up until the moment that Samuel anointed him, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. And suddenly he's got this leadership potential. He knows where it comes from, and he knows he's lost it, and he knows that David's got it. And it enrages him. It just rather than accept things as they are, rather than accept his own shortcomings, he rages against David. He is being again urged on by this evil spirit. Down in verse 13, therefore Saul removed him from his presence and appointed him as commander of 1,000, for he went out and came in before the people. And David was prospering in all his ways, for the Lord was with him. But when Saul saw that he was prospering greatly, he dreaded him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, and he went and came in before them. So this coming in and going out, it was clear that as David was engaged in these military campaigns, that he was doing so in a way, he was conducting them in a way to, again, apparently to the greatest protection of the people. And it was apparent to them. It was apparent to them that he was having the success. It was apparent to them that he was being protector to, and they saw him, and therefore, as it says, they loved him for it. If you can imagine being in fear, in dread of having all of your possessions stolen at any given time, of being attacked or assaulted by an enemy force, you would be naturally grateful for the ones that are protecting you. Then Saul said to David, here is my older daughter Merab. I will give her to you for a wife. Only be a valiant man for me and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, my hand shall not be against him, but the hand of the Philistines be against him. But David said to Saul, who am I, and who is my life or my father's family in Israel, that I should be the king's son-in-law? So it came about at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was the Mehathalite for a wife. Again, the questions come up about this giving of this daughter. First of all, he offers this daughter to David if he'll continue fighting. David recognizes that he's really not worthy. And it's possible that Saul sees this reluctance on David's part as perhaps he's not interested in being the king's son-in-law. But Merab, in fact, had been promised to the man who killed Goliath. So in reality, she should have been David's wife already at this point, and was not. There is a breakdown here from Saul that he makes a lot of promises. We'll find out that he makes a lot of promises that apparently he has no intention of fulfilling. He's made this oath that with the attack with Goliath, or with the battle with Goliath, the man who kills him will be the king's son-in-law. He made that promise. Apparently, he had no intention of fulfilling that promise. He makes other promises too. We'll find to David, he's a man, we find out, who will give his word but not keep it. So, and we see the rationale behind his action. Saul wants to send David into battle against the Philistines, hoping the Philistines will solve his problem. If the Philistines go out there, if I send David out there and he wants to be the king's son-in-law, and if I send David out there fighting the Philistines, maybe one of those Philistines will get lucky and kill David, and then I'll be rid of him, and I won't have to basically soil my hands with the task. David will be gone, and it'll all be on the Philistines rather than on me. And so he continues apparently to send David out, hoping that he's going to be killed. And of course, David continues to meet with tremendous success instead, so that it seems that you can imagine how the utter frustration of Saul as he's trying to throw these various plots around, and he's trying to work against David, and effectively he's trying to work against God. And the more he plots, the deeper ingrained David gets with the nation of Israel, even with his own family. He becomes more deeply ingrained with them. And this has got to be driving Saul crazy. He sees another opportunity here in verse 20. It says, then Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David when they told Saul the thing was agreeable to him. And I'm sorry? Oh, hello. So, comment? Oh, okay. Then Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David when they told Saul the thing was agreeable to him. And Saul thought, I will give her to him, that she may become a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Then Saul said to David, for a second time, you may be my son-in-law today. Then Saul commanded his servants, speak to David secretly, saying, behold, the king delights in you, and all his servants love you. Now, therefore, become the king's son-in-law. So David's servant spoke these words to David, but David said, is it trivial in your sight to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and lightly esteemed? And the servants of Saul reported to him according to these words which David spoke. Saul then said, thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire any dowry, except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, to take vengeance on the king's enemies. Now Saul planned to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. When his servants told David these words, it pleased David to become the king's son-in-law. Before the days had expired, David rose up and went, he and his men, and struck down 200 men of the Philistines. Then David brought their foreskins, and they gave him in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. So Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, as a wife. When Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, then Saul was even more afraid of David. Thus Saul was David's enemy continually. Here's another opportunity he sees to get David killed off by the Philistines, because that's the most desirable situation for Saul. If I can get David killed by the Philistines, I don't have to take any of the blame. The people of Israel, people of Judah, they love David, and if I do something to him, it's going to look badly on me. But I can kill him by the hand of the Philistines, and a great national hero has died, and woe is us. But now David's gone. You can understand his strategy here. He lets David know that he doesn't want a fancy dowry. David, of course, has been reluctant to try and become the king's son-in-law because he doesn't have the dowry. He doesn't have what he thinks is an appropriate dowry to offer to a king, that he might marry the king's daughter. But so Saul comes up with this strategy. I know. I'll tell him that all I want is vengeance against my enemies, and if he'll bring me the foreskins of these Philistines, these, of course, the Philistines, uncircumcised men, in order to get these 100 foreskins, you're going to, you don't go up and you're not going to ask for them. You're going to have to kill the men involved. And so he's basically saying, you kill 100 Philistines for me, and 100 soldiers or men of the Philistines, and I'll let you be my son-in-law. And this sounds good to David. So he goes out and delivers 200, double the number. And this would have required a great victory on his part. It would have required a substantial battle to have met this many men in combat and defeated them this way. We see that, as it says here in verse 26, before the days had expired, that apparently Saul, in order to speed this up, had put a deadline on it. It wasn't just deliver 100 foreskins, it was deliver 100 foreskins by a certain date, by a particular date. You will deliver this to me. And therefore kind of putting even more pressure on David. But David, again, he shows himself to be a competent military commander. And again, we see what happens out of this in verse 29, that Saul was even, verse 28 and 29, when Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, then Saul was even more afraid of David, and thus Saul was David's enemy continually. Now, you would have thought at some point Saul would have begun to catch on that you're not going to win this. You would have thought at some point he would have figured this out. As David continues to ingrain himself deeper and deeper into Saul's family, his best friend is Saul's son, and now his wife is Saul's daughter. And as it says here, Saul understands the Lord is with David. Well, if you're battling against David, you're essentially battling against God. And yet Saul, in his arrogance, doesn't care. He doesn't care the fact that he's battling against God. And again, we find out that he treats him as an enemy. It shows again that, as we said here, Saul's only concerned with what he wants, and he was willing to do God's will, so long as God's will and his will lined up. If God wants me to do something I already wanted to do, okay, that's fine. But the minute that God wants me to do something I don't want to do, then I'll do what I want to do and not what God wants to do. And this section also shows us that sometimes the godly suffer. David here, a godly man, and even his family, Jonathan, ultimately will suffer. All of the family will suffer because of Saul's behavior. Sometimes the godly suffer through no fault of their own. We see some passages like this over in the book of Psalms, chapter 7, for example. Chapter 7 and verse 12. If a man does not repent, he will sharpen his sword. He has bent his bow and had made it ready. He has also prepared for himself deadly weapons. He makes his arrows fiery shafts. Behold, he travails with wickedness, and he conceives mischief and brings forth falsehood. He has dug a pit and hollowed it out, and he has fallen into the hole which he made. His mischief will return upon his own head, and his violence will descend upon his own pate. Again, we see the outcome of these men. We read over in Romans 8 and verse 28. It says, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God and to those who are called according to his purpose. We understand that all things, of course, is all things contained herein. But we also understand that sometimes, evil things befall godly people because of the actions of ungodly people around them. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is some irony here. There is some irony here. That's certainly the case. There is some ironic moment here. But again, we see this contrast between Saul and David. We also see the contrast between Saul and Jonathan. Jonathan understands that God is giving the kingdom. God is taking the kingdom from Saul and is giving the kingdom to David. Jonathan understands that. And Jonathan is willing to sort of let God's will be done. That seems to be Jonathan's attitude. Let God's will be done. And Saul's attitude is, oh no, we're going to kill David. We're not going to let God's will be done. We're going to cut this off. I can override God's will. Is sort of Saul's attitude here. All right. Any question or comment on this? We continue then into chapter 19. It says, now Saul told Jonathan his son and all of his servants to put David to death. But Jonathan, Saul's son, greatly delighted in David. So Jonathan told David, saying, Saul, my father, is seeking to put you to death. Now, therefore, please be on guard in the morning and stay in a secret place and hide yourself. And I will go out and stand before my father in the field where you are, and I will speak to my father about you. If I find out anything, then shall tell you. Then Jonathan spoke well of David to his father, to Saul his father, and said to him, do not let the king sin against his servant David, since he has not sinned against you, and since his deeds have been very beneficial to you. For he took his life in his hand and struck the Philistine, and the Lord brought about a great deliverance for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then do you sin against innocent blood by putting David to death without a cause? And Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan, and Saul vowed, as the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. Then Jonathan called David, and Jonathan told him all these words. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as formerly. So Jonathan here is trying to be the peacemaker. Again, we see something of the character of Jonathan. He comes across as a very admirable, very honorable man. He decides he's going to be the peacemaker. He doesn't know what this conflict is between his father and David. It seems that he doesn't perceive what the problem is. But he makes his case for David. He makes the points that I've got up here on the board. He points out to Saul, hey, you are still the king. You are still the king, and David is still your servant. He has been serving you. He has done nothing against you. Indeed, he's done a lot of things that were good for you. He's done a lot of good for Israel. He's done a lot of good for you. He said, you can imagine when he says, you saw him go out there, you saw him kill Goliath, and you were glad for it. Why then are you now turning on David when he's done all these good things for you? And finally he tries to point out to him, you're going to be sinning against innocent blood if you put him to death. Making in effect a very strong case that you need to knock it off. It's a very reasoned approach to his father. It's a very emotional, I think, approach to his father, bringing back up to him these facts about everything that's been done for him. As a result, we see that apparently Saul rather, in a calmer moment, brings himself under control, and he agrees. We see him, he takes this great oath. He says, as the Lord lives, I will not put David to death. Now, that's an oath, That's just not saying, okay, all right, I won't kill David. He's saying so with an oath before God that, as God lives, I won't kill David. So it adds a level of importance, a level of commitment to it, more than just giving his word. But as pointed out by several commentators, including, as I pointed out here, Matthew Henry, in his commentary, says the ease with which Saul violated other oaths makes the sincerity of this one justly questionable. And yet both Jonathan and David, we see, are willing to take Saul at his word, and Jonathan brings David back to Saul. They kind of basically shake hands, make up, and now David is back in his presence. It says back in his presence as formerly. So whatever, I can imagine that Jonathan especially thinks, okay, we've settled this now. We're in good shape. We've settled this now. Unfortunately, not so, because we go into the next section, chapter 8. Then there was war again. David went out and fought with the Philistines and defeated them with a great slaughter, so that they fled before him. So David has this great military success, and instead of Saul being happy about it, Saul being pleased that his enemies are being destroyed, no, now there was an evil spirit from the Lord on Saul as he was sitting in his house with a spear in his hand, and David was playing the harp with his hand. So Saul tried to pin David to the wall with the spear, but he slipped away out of Saul's presence so that he struck the spear into the wall. And David fled and escaped that night. This was apparently done with nobody else around. Maybe it was just Saul and David in the room, because apparently there were no other witnesses to this. Certainly Jonathan doesn't seem to know anything about this, that Saul has once again tried to kill David, and David has escaped out of his hand. Saul has had enough. Saul's no longer, he's tired of waiting for the Philistines to do the job for him. The Philistines aren't doing what he wants, so he decides, all right, I'm going to take more direct measures. Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him in order to put him to death in the morning. He sends a hit squad. He sends, basically private agents of some sort, and he sends them on their way to go ahead and kill David. But Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be put to death. So Michal let David down through a window, and he went out and fled and escaped. And Michal took the household idol and laid it in the bed and put a quilt of goat's hair on its head and covered it with clothes. When Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, he is sick. Then Saul sent messengers to see David, saying, bring him up to me on his bed that I may put him to death. When the messengers entered, behold, the household idol was in the bed with the quilt of goat's hair on its head. So Saul said to Michal, why have you deceived me like this to let my enemy go so that he has escaped? And Michal said to Saul, he said to me, let me go. Why should I put you to death? So again, we see the events as they unfold here. Here's this, David has this continuing success against the Philistines. It triggers this murderous rage and envy in Saul. And again, we see that this evil spirit coming from, it's actually from Satan, that comes with the permission of God, is intended to test Saul. Saul, again, I will argue, is still in full control of what his actions are. He just chooses not to control. Here's Michal, his David's wife, but Saul's daughter. She helps him to escape, and then she even kind of helps set up the deception using this household idol. Some of the commentators question about what is the purpose, the meaning of this household idol. Some have suggested that it was perhaps Michal's personal idol, that it would have been some sort of a family heirloom that would have been passed down, similar to Rachel when she left from her father's house, and she took her father's personal idols with her. Some have suggested that this might have been for some sort of worship, deity worship, but others have suggested that this was maybe nothing more than like a statue of some kind, sort of like almost I don't know, like exactly decorative is the word to use, but just sort of a family heirloom that's around the house. So she puts it in bed. She puts on this goat's hair on top. The word here that's used for goat's hair is actually kind of obscure. Some of the writers, in fact, Josephus, I think, calls it a goat's liver, and some have suggested that she had like this goat's liver that was still twitching, having been freshly removed from a goat, and that twitching would make it look like somebody laying in the bed. Just a little odd story as an aside. But obviously their dwelling, their apartment, if you will, is in the wall of at the wall of the city where they're staying, and she's able to let him down out of a window, and he's able to escape out of the city that way. And David, we get to see something of David's thoughts on this. Rather than seeing them secondhand, we can read it firsthand. We can see what David thought because he wrote a psalm about this. If you look with me over at Psalm 59, it says, this is, if you read the introduction of this, it says, for the choir director, set to Ashtasheth, a miktam of David, when Saul sent men and they watched the house in order to kill him. So apparently this is the psalm, a psalm that David wrote in remembrance of this event. And he writes and says, deliver me from my enemies, O my God, set me securely on high way from those who rise up against me. Deliver me from those who do iniquity, and save me from men of bloodshed. For behold, they have set an ambush for my life. Fierce men launch an attack against me. Not for my transgression or for my sin, O Lord. For no guilt of mine, they run and set themselves against me. Arouse thyself to help me and see. And thou, O Lord, God of hosts and God of Israel, awake to punish all the nations. Do not be gracious to any who are treacherous in iniquity. They return at evening. They howl like a dog. They go around the city. Behold, they belch forth from their mouth. Swords are in their lips, for they say, who hears? But thou, O Lord, dost laugh at them. Thou dost scoff at all the nations. Because of his strength I will watch for thee, for God is my stronghold. My God in his loving kindness will meet me. God will let me look triumphantly upon my foes. Do not slay them, lest my people forget. Scatter them by thy power, and bring them down, O Lord, our shield. On account of the sin of their mouth and of their words of their lips, let them even be caught in their pride, and on account of curses and lies which they utter. Destroy them in wrath, destroy them, and they may be no more. That men may know that God rules in Jacob to the ends of the earth. And they return at evening, they howl like a dog, they go around the city, they wander about for food, and growl if they are not satisfied. But as for me, I shall sing of thy strength. Yes, I shall joyfully sing of thy loving kindness in the morning, for thou hast been my stronghold and a refuge in the day of my distress. O my strength, I will sing praises to thee, for God is my stronghold, the God who shows me loving kindness. And so here is David as he describes this event. Apparently, we gather from this there was a very dedicated search made for him to try and find him, figure out how he had escaped. If you recall, if we read again the events of this chapter in chapter 19, or in chapter 19, apparently these messengers, when they can't find David, they seize his wife and bring her before Saul. And Saul, of course, confronts his daughter and says, why have you deceived me like this and let my enemy go? Makes it clear to her, hey, this is my enemy. And she comes up with a story basically telling Saul, well, he threatened to kill me. He was going to kill me if I didn't let him go. And of course, this story fits with Saul's idea about David. And so he's, I guess, willing to take her at her word. But you see the deception that she has to use to get out of this. We again see the how this family is kind of at odds with one another. Saul is determined to kill David, and other members of his family are determined to preserve David. David flees from Saul. He goes to see Samuel. In this time, David is obviously in a real fix. He's in a real tight situation, and he naturally turns to the one man he thinks might be able to help him. He goes to Samuel to sort of seek that spiritual counseling that might help him in this situation. In verse 18, now David fled and escaped and came to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And Samuel went and stayed at Naioth. And it was told Saul, saying, behold, David is at Naioth in Ramah. Again, I would point out to you that Saul apparently has set up a fairly extensive intelligence network so that he can track the movements of just about anybody. And especially if he needs to know where David is, he can find people that are going to report on him as soon as he finds out any information. Then Saul sent messengers to take David, but when they saw the company of the prophets prophesying with Samuel standing and presiding over them, the Spirit of the Lord came upon the messengers, and they also prophesied. And when it was told Saul, he sent other messengers, and they also prophesied. So Saul sent messengers again the third time, and they also prophesied. Then he himself went to Ramah and came as far as the large well that is in Seku. And he asked and said, where are Samuel and David? And someone said, behold, they are in Naioth at Ramah. And he proceeded there to Naioth and Ramah, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him also, so that he went along prophesying continually until he came to Naioth and Ramah. He also stripped off his clothes, and he too prophesied before Samuel, and lay down naked all that day and all that night. Therefore, they say, is Saul also among the prophets? Again, David flees to the one man he thinks might still have some influence with Saul, who might be able to protect him from Saul, and that's Samuel. And so naturally, David is seeking out that he's turning to God for protection. He knows Samuel's a man of God. He turns to God for protection. We see Saul here sending these three sets of messengers. All three men end up prophesying before Samuel. They forget their mission. They forget what they're intending to do. They're busy prophesying. And so they discontinue their mission. Finally, Saul himself comes. And he's going to get David. I'll do it myself, apparently, is his attitude. He strips himself naked and lays down in front of Samuel. And again, some commentators, noting this, said that, here God has stripped, first of all, he has stripped Saul of his dynasty. He's told him, you'll not have your dynasty. You're going to be king, but not anybody of your family after you. Next, he strips Saul of his kingdom, saying, you've disobeyed me again. You're no longer going to be king. And finally, now he strips Saul of his dignity. Here's the king of Israel, laying naked on the ground in front of Samuel, prophesying and demonstrating to anyone who cares to come by and see that he's not fit to be king. And again, we might consider as we look at this and look at this event, what message is God sending to Saul? He is demonstrating, in effect, his complete authority over Saul. Saul has sent these three waves, these three groups of messengers. Each one has failed. Now, finally, Saul himself has come. He has failed and is now laying naked in front of Samuel. If Saul had taken a moment and considered what was happening to him, he might have realized, wait a minute, I'm in a fight over my head. I'm in way over my head. And I'm fighting against God, and God is not going to let me win. And he might have humbled himself. He might have even saved himself by humbling himself. But no, he would not reconsider this hatred that he has for David. He will not give up his hatred. He will continue to come after him and come after him and come after him. All right, I think I'm going to stop there. It's about 20 after. We'll stop there, and I'll continue on into chapter 20 next week. I appreciate your attention. Any comments or questions from anyone as we conclude this morning? All right, thank you. Appreciate your attention.